Hello, my name is Eric Garvan, and welcome to Fairfax Playhouse. Today we have a really exciting show. I have Marsha Cole here, and she's a playwright who has won a number of awards, and she's also done some very interesting work with reenacting and presenting the lives of people during and after the Civil War, and we're going to see some of those presentations today. So I'd like to introduce my guest, Marsha, and ask her to tell us a little about yourself. Tell us how you've done and what you've done, and just let us get to know you a little bit.
Well, I'm a native Washingtonian.
Oh.
And they claim there aren't very many, but I know plenty. And this all started in 1998 when I went to see an exhibit at the Maryland Historical Society.
Ah. Okay.
And it was done by Fred Wilson, called Mind the Museum. And what he did was he took some of the museum holdings and juxtaposed them to create a new narrative of the African American experience. And in that exhibit, I saw a primary document, an estate inventory. And looking at it further in the catalog, I noticed that the property included not only animals and crops, but human beings.
Wow.
And that was sobering enough. But when I saw that an old mule named Kobe was worth $5, but an old slave named Hannah was worth $1, that took me aback. And as is my habit, I journal about things that I find meaningful to make sense of what I've seen.
Mm-hmm.
And afterwards, I had the occasion to take a playwriting workshop through Theater Lab in DC.
Okay.
And a closing exercise was to write a 10-minute play. So I used the notes from my journaling to create a 10-minute play. And I got very good feedback from that. Paul Donaldson had brought in some actors who read it, and one of the actors told me this was a really good idea and I should go further with it. And I remember what Les Brown said, the motivational speaker said, sometimes just do it yourself. And he said, what would you do if you knew if you thought you knew what you were doing? So I said, I'm just going to do this the best way I can, and let the devil take the hindmost.
Let the devil take the hindmost?
Yeah.
Is that a playwriting phrase? I never heard anybody say that before. What does what does that mean? Before we go any further.
It just means, it just has to take care of itself. Just
okay.
let the chips fall where they may.
Let the chips, okay.
Yeah.
I know what that means, okay.
So I just did everything that I thought needed to be done to get this thing going. Wanda Whiteside, the artistic director, liked the play and asked if I wanted to have it entered in the Women's Voices Theater Festival in 2015. It was the first one in DC, our first festival in DC. So I think Les Brown said, just say yes to life.
Wonderful.
So I said, okay, let's go for it. So she found the actors and did all the staging, and it went wonderfully.
Great.
We got some great reviews, and even got a clip on the BBC, an interview at the gala.
Really?
And so I was very pleased to be included that way. So very wonderful reviews, and someone says, well, Marsha, keep writing. And I have kept writing. When I ride down the road going to the Carolinas and I see the woods and the vast fields, I wonder if I would have had the courage to do that.
Okay.
Because there was very little cover in many places, and you really didn't know where you were going. You just had to trust and go by what you thought you heard to go to make that journey. So I used actual stories and put them into a poetic form, and buttressed that with what I knew about history, and filled in the gaps with what could have happened also.
Okay.
And that worked very well. So I've been doing that in DC, and getting very good feedback, and have some presentations coming up in the future.
Well, you know, one of the things that I really want for the audience to pay attention to as we see your presentation, and even what you're presenting now, is you have turned stories into the human story. And that's something that totally blew me away. My background, I've seen a lot of plays and worked here in Washington, D.C. at the Shakespeare Theater, so I've seen a lot of the big productions and that sort of thing. And when I saw one of the pieces that you did in Georgetown, and you talk about a man who was lynched, and rather than talking about the lynching, you focus on the fact that he had a wedding ring and that he must have been married, and now here's someone who doesn't come home for dinner. Here's someone who is, and that just blew me away. And I really want to ask you a little bit more about how you think about your characters different from other people, I think, who talk about them as slaves and not as people.
Well, that was a series on lynching. And I had written a number of poems on lynching, and that was one of the things I won in the College Language Association writing contest. I won first prize for.
Really? Wait a minute, say that again?
The College Language Association creative writing contest.
You won
first prize for
first
my
prize.
Poetry on lynching.
Wow.
And they said they didn't know I was an older student, so they thought it was very mature of me to write it. But what I tried to do was that stemmed from when I saw a picture in one of my textbooks of William Biggerstaff. And not only was it the fact that he was a well-dressed man hung, but it was the people around him. And then I also noticed the ring on his finger. And that triggered my imagination. That signified to me that he had a human connection. That he was possibly married, and that somebody was not going to see him again the way they last saw him. And I try to put myself in the shoes of his family members, of his deceased self, you know, because he had thoughts before this, while this was happening, before this happened. And I just tried to be empathetic and imagine how people feel, and that's where that came from.
Now, I saw another piece that you did that also entered into an area that I had never thought of. And, you know, like a lot of people, particularly in this area and other parts of the country, who have educations and all that, we think, yeah, we've learned a lot, we know a lot, but I had never thought you mentioned about a dress that a woman was wearing, and it had a patch on it. And I always thought that these patches were, it was ripped or torn, it showed that they were poor and they didn't have, and they had to mend their clothes and that sort of thing. And what you brought out was the idea that if you have a dress hanging on the back of a door, I guess, was it on the back of a door or a wall or something?
Well, you know, I wish I had thought that myself, but I saw a reference to that people often thought it was patching because it was worn, but the women sometimes amended their clothes to personalize it, to give it distinction.
So now it's your...
It was their dress. It wasn't just some other dress, but by the way that they added things to it, embellishments, it was their unique style.
Again, the humanness that you really bring out, that someone would, this is mine.
It's something like what they would do with the quilts, when they would use every scrap of fabric they had. When you know how hard it was to make fabric, you know why they used it all. And so they just made something unique that through their own creativity and vision, they did that.
I did that. That's really... Now, another thing that, once again, I was very surprised when I thought about what you were presenting. This idea that what were the hopes and dreams of a person who might be enslaved, that they would be presented as someone inside a family. This idea of what is the worth of this person compared to an animal, or, you know, like how that would play out Like, how do you think that actually played out in the life of how these people thought about themselves if they knew that their value was compared to some animal?
Well, in my play, A Matter of Worth, I imagined they frequently knew, and I imagined that my character Hannah knew,
Okay.
and she had something to say about that.
Oh, really?
And she knew she was infinitely more valuable than a mule because she'd given her whole life to service. And she says that. My name is Hannah, and I'm 73 years old. That's right, 73 years old. I've been working right here for the Goodwins all my life. There's been talk going around lately about this here tell thing called freedom. I tried to tell Agnes what was afoot and maybe it'd be time for her to make it on through because she's still young enough. But she asked me not to talk like that. They'd get us both in trouble, me for talking and her for listening. I said, gal, do you hear yourself? Can't talk, can't listen. Must be something powerful about words or us using them, or why else they be hiding books and all where we can't see them. Will seeing them change our minds about being slaves? My mind's been made up. It ain't right. Then she want to know why I'm still here, why I never went for free. I say, got my reasons. I've been free all along in my mind, no matter where this old body's been. Then I say, let me tell you one thing. Even freedom ain't free. Cost some folks their lives going for it. Then quiet like I took around by that big oak tree across the field. And I pointed over yonder. And I said, see there? That's where they threw what was left of poor old Q. Now, what kind of name is that? They didn't give him no real name like most folks, just give him a letter Q, and he had the answer to it. Well, he decided he was going to run off on the new moon a while back, so he's going for free. The dogs caught him first, like to rip the hide off of him, and brought him back and made us all come out and watch. Beat Q till he stopped hollering. Beat him some more till he stopped moving. Old man say, this is what we do to thieving niggas. Because he stole himself. Any more y'all think about stealing my property, gets the same, he say. A lot of folks thought more than once about running off after that. But not everybody. No. Thoughts of freedom were never far from the minds of the enslaved African. The following are tales of those who would not wait for freedom, but took it by ingenious means, like William and Ellen Craft. Ellen, fair as sweet magnolia. William, dark as just plowed earth. Husband and wife to each other, but not upheld in white man's courts. Hatched a scheme to take their freedom. No one knew their bold design. In disguise, they missed detection. Who would risk escape by day? Calmly, let us board the train. Calmly, let us take our seats. Let's not raise suspicion. Ellen passed for white with ease, posing as a frail young man, traveling north on family matters, keeping track of what he owned. Her bandaged face prevented speaking. Darkened glasses hid her eyes. Injured hand could sign no papers, couldn't do without her slave. William, nearby at her service, feigned submission looking down. Speaking only with permission, his explanation rang with truth. Nodding yes in sympathy, the train conductor waved his hands. Never mind, his gesture signaled when he moved on down the aisle. Who could hear their beating hearts, fast and hard a drummer's drum? Glances held a dozen meanings, but they knew to hold their tongues. swiftly. Swiftly they traveled. Train a swaying, tracks a bending, stretching north away. When they reached their destination, friends were waiting for the pair. Stepping off the iron horse, breathing deeply, freedom's air. Steal away, we stole ourselves to freedom. Mr. and Mrs. William Craft, husband, wife, and free.
Wow.
And as she talks about the other slaves on the inventory, and their value, their price is mentioned, she talks about what she knows of their, something about them and their lives.
Okay.
So while that's why I chose the title "A Matter of Worth," because no one has a right to tell you what your value is.
Wow.
We have intrinsic value. And she says this in the end, in the closing poem, that God didn't say $1 when he got to her. And I think we all have value, and I just felt it need to be said in that way.
Of the characters that you have encountered, who are some other characters? Now, you mentioned the man who was lynched, and you said a name.
William Biggerstaff.
William Biggerstaff. So this is an actual person who was actually lynched.
My poetry is based on actual people, actual events, and fleshed out with real history, and also empathetic feelings, how I imagine they felt. So there's facts, and then there's also how I imagine they might have felt about it.
At that time and what they were experiencing.
Yeah.
So who were some of the other characters that you've encountered that also caught your attention?
Well, as I'll be presenting today, there will be William Craft and Ellen Craft, who were enslaved, and they decided to take their own freedom. And their story has become well known, but I give it my own treatment. And then when I came across the story of Henry Box Brown and how he chose to seek his freedom, is very unique. That was an actual story.
And how did he choose to seek his freedom?
He had himself shipped to freedom in a box.
In a box? So he mailed himself?
He had himself mailed to freedom.
That was ingenious.
That's why I chose him.
Okay. And there's a woman that you're presenting today, Charlotte
Scott.
Charlotte Scott. Tell us a little bit about her and how you came to come across her and why you decided to actually present her life.
Well, I was looking for maybe additional stories of to add to my runaway, Underground Railroad roster. And going down the rabbit hole of Google searches, I came across her name. And I didn't know her, and found out that she had been instrumental in having a monument raised in D.C. to President Lincoln. And so I went to see the monument myself, and there it was, as big as day, and I said, I had no idea. I want to know more about her. And so I did some research on her, and about the same, not long after that, I met up with a group of women called Freed.
Freed?
Freed, F-R-E-E-D. Female Reenactors of Distinction. And they're like a sister group for the African American Civil War Museum here in Washington, D.C. on U Street.
Really?
And what they do is they find women or select women who were freed or were never slaves during that period and tell their stories. People who have made, women who have made some contribution that should be recognized and kept alive through history. So when I went to one of the meetings and decided this was something that was in alignment with what I was doing, which was telling history in my own way, and I had to select someone, I chose Charlotte Scott.
I see.
And so I looked her up and tried to find more research, and I'm still researching her life to develop a way of talking about her contribution, and it's come out very well.
So let me be sure I'm understanding what you're saying. You're saying this woman, Charlotte Scott,
Hmm.
like what years was this and what is the name of this monument? If somebody wanted to actually go and see it, like where would they go and what's the story behind it?
Well, she was born around 1803 or 1805.
1803. So this is before the Civil War.
Right.
Okay.
And so the monument is in Washington, D.C., in what we call Lincoln Park
Lincoln Park.
on East Capitol Street between 11th and 13th Streets.
I see.
And it's a big grassy area, and on one end is a statue devoted to Mary McLeod Bethune.
Bethune-Cookman College named after her? Is that the
I
same?
believe so.
Okay.
And on the other end is the statue of Lincoln freeing the slave.
And that statue, how's that connected to Charlotte Scott?
Because she through her efforts, suggestion and efforts, and first contribution, that statue came into fruition.
I see.
And I thought that was pretty significant that after getting out of slavery and just beginning to earn some money, she used her monies to start a campaign, to begin the campaign to have the statue implemented.
Well, you know, we're going to continue on with this. This is a very interesting topic. So with all the conversation about what women have done, women's history,
Right.
one would think that a park with two incredible women's work in it, that this would be more known. Mary McLeod Bethune on one end and a statue. I didn't know that any woman was instrumental in erecting any statue, even in America, never mind in Washington, D.C. I mean, I just didn't know that.
Never mind a freed slave.
Never mind a freed slave. I mean, that's really, that's a story that not only is an African-American story, that's a woman's story. That's an incredible story.
Yes.
And, okay, so one other thing that I'm kind of curious about, in the work that we see that you're going to give us a taste of, what was her feelings that made her move for a statue to be made as opposed to, I don't know, cooking a special meal or, you know, whatever, you know, people sort of did. I mean, like to make a statue, that's kind of a big deal, I would think, even in today's world.
Well, I guess, to her, Mr. Lincoln was like a friend, a very
I don't know what you
special
mean
friend.
now.
I mean,
How did she know him? How did they interact?
they were aware. She was aware of what he had done to free the slaves.
Okay.
So that made him very dear to her. And
Sure.
He took, because that was an unpopular thing in many circles.
Mm-hmm.
And so to make that historic move was important to her and many other freed
Okay.
slaves. So she just felt that that was something that she wanted to, a statue would be more permanent than a meal
Okay.
and would
Okay.
endure, had a chance of enduring.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what was her driving force behind that.
That's amazing. For someone, even in today's world, for someone to have a statue made that eventually goes into a park and is on display. So roughly what year was that statue placed in Washington?
Well, it was on the 11th anniversary of Mr. Lincoln's assassination, his death.
Okay.
So that was 1876.
So that statue is over a century old.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, that's amazing. So, Marshall, what I'd like to do is just ask you very briefly, are there some work that you have in mind? And then I'm sure some people would like to hear your poetry and know where they could get it, if there's a website or a way to get in touch with you, if you have a book coming out. How would we see more of your work? And as I said, what are some of the things, just briefly, that you're planning to do in the future? Some characters, some situations that have caught your attention that some of our viewers might want to also kind of do a little bit of research and follow your lead.
Well, I'm developing a presentation on slavery childhood. That intrigues me because that's where you are formed, your personality is formed in childhood to a large extent. And so I wanted to see how a slave childhood compares to childhood today and its impact on the adult person. So that's something that I'm looking at. And what I discovered is they were, for all the restrictions put on them as African Americans, they still found time to be children. They still found time to be part of families before they were separated. And so that's something I'm exploring.
Interesting. I don't think, has anybody done that? I've never heard of anybody looking at the impact of a slave childhood on the adult that develops.
Well, I wouldn't say no one has done it, but I certainly am giving it my take and including what I think needs to be included in the discussion. So that's well underway and looking forward to getting that done soon. And another work I have in the back of my mind is sort of fanciful, a play that is an all-male cast, as I see it right now, that it combines actual historic figures with some literary characters, and it makes a statement about black males.
Okay, all right, that sounds like something that we're going to have to keep our ears open. You're kind of keeping a little bit under wraps.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, good for you. Good thinking. Something I'd like to just quickly add, and then we'll get to the presentation. A number of years ago, I was in a library, and I was doing some research on urban planning, and I came across an article that pointed out, for some reason, that the author began to speculate on whether alcoholism in the African American community was something that was actually bred into the population.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea that they came up with, they compared, in the African American community, you will see liquor stores, beer, in the middle of the block. They'll be accessible. They'll normally be in places where you go to buy groceries, they are legitimized by where they are placed in the community. And this author traced back and said that they thought, and I don't know whether this is true or not, but I'm mentioning this as something that kind of ties in a little bit with what you had mentioned, but they thought that if you wanted to control someone, you work them through the week and then you give them alcohol on the weekends, and those people who are more disposed to being affected by the alcohol are the ones that you allow to breed, and now they're easier to control. So if you do that over a number of generations, then you create a population that has a disposition to alcoholism.
Well, that's interesting. I do know that historically the Native Americans were given something they called firewater.
Okay.
And so they have a problem with alcoholism. And I know that as far as the slaves were concerned, there would be periods where they were allowed to celebrate and they were allowed to have liquor on those occasions too. And in the Caribbean, where they had sugar cane, then there was a rum. So that wouldn't be surprising.
It would be interesting to find out when was alcohol, at what age was alcohol introduced to a slave community? Is that happens at 5, it happens at 10, and was there some intentionality around that? So those are some things. You really open up a real sort of areas for investigation. And if somebody wanted to get in touch with you, once again, like how would they do that, or look for your work, how would they do that?
Well, you did mention a book, and I do have a book in the works.
Okay.
It's a collection of poems that I've developed, history-based poems. And it's called, working title is Light and Dark Places.
Okay.
And I can be reached at my website, historyworthwhile.com.
Historyworthwhile.com. Okay, and we'll put that on the screen later.
Okay. And through that portal, and also
An email address, perhaps?
mecole01@gmail.com.
Okay, so give us that one more time.
mecole01 cole@gmail.com.
And is that Cole, C-O-L-E?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, and we're really looking forward to seeing your presentation.
Thank you
And
so much.
once again, for everyone who's viewing Fairfax Playhouse, we thank you. And let's take a look at what Marsha Cole here has to.
My name is Charlotte Scott. You may call me Miss Charlotte. I like the sound of that. I'm a freed woman now, but it weren't always so. I was born 1803, 1805, somewhere thereabouts. They didn't always keep such good records when it came to birth of slaves. That's why I'm not for sure. Anyhow, I was born in Virginia on a plantation owned by Captain William Scott and his wife, Anne. They named me Charlotte. My mother was a slave owned by Captain Scott. You see, by law, if your mother is free, you're considered freeborn. But if your mother's a slave, well, you're a slave too. I was born into slavery. That's how it went. Didn't matter so much about the father because thinking on that too much could cause problems in some situations. There was a lot going on in the world around the time I was born. The United States government made that big Louisiana purchase and got a lot of land with that one. Haiti was gaining its independence. Black folks was glad when they heard about that, but we didn't dare let on. Meriwether Lewis, William Clark and his man York, slave, same thing, along with a bunch of other adventure seekers, set off on an expedition looking for a way to the West Coast. The Northwest Passage, they called it. Ohio came in as a free state, and that was important to me down the line. And the Underground Railroad was picking up steam. More and more runaways were making it to freedom. The Scotts owned over 1,000 acres of land in Virginia, run through by the James River between Campbell County and Bedford in the area you call Lynchburg today. Back then, it was prime timberland before they cleared it to raise tobacco as a cash crop. That's where we lived, black and white together. I served all the Scott households, going wherever I was needed. Captain and Miss Ann had 12 children. I helped take care of them all while they were growing up, and believe you me, there was always plenty to do. Early on, I wasn't much older than the child I was looking after. When Captain died, in his will, he left a big piece of property to the older children to divide up, and the rest to his wife, Anne. The two youngest boys, Hugh and Thomas, would get theirs when she died. But she took pity on them and turned it over while she was still living, if they promised to take care of her before she passed on. And they did. I was married to my man Willis by then, as much as slave marriages counted. Slave couples could be separated or sold from each other at any time. We were lucky. We lived on the same plantation. Well, we didn't have one of those abroad marriages where the husband and wife had different owners and lived miles apart on different plantations. Come settlement, Willis belonged to Master Hugh, and I belonged to Master Thomas. That worked out real well for us. Well, Master Thomas got married and had 5 children. I was about the same age as his first wife, Margaret, but when she died, their daughter Margaret was just 2 years old. I've been taking care of that child before her mama died and just kept right on like I had been doing, right on through when her stepmother and grandmother died. Well, little Margaret grew up and married Dr. William Rucker, her second cousin. I was loaned to her when she got married, and you might say I was a kind of wedding present. Well, I helped her set up housekeeping and one thing and another. When her father died, Master Thomas, in 1861, she inherited me outright. His will had me down as worth $500. Time came, there was talk about going to war. It seems there was a big fuss about us black folks being slaves. Some folks down south wanted to carry slavery all the way to the West Coast. But there were other reasons too. States' rights and the election of Mr. Lincoln as president. They should have called it the Uncivil War, if you ask me. Dr. Rucker ran into trouble for siding with the Union and got himself put in jail. He never was too keen on this slavery business. Nope. That put him at big odds with his family members. Well, when the fighting got too close, Dr. Rucker and Margaret decided she should leave Virginia and go to Marietta, Ohio, and take their 4 children and household slaves. But the Federal Army wouldn't transport us slaves unless she freed us first. That's how I came to be free in Ohio. Did you know back then slaves couldn't have last names? And nobody bothered by calling us Mr. or Miss. But I decided as a free woman, I should have a last name. So I chose the name Scott. That way I had a full name, Charlotte Scott. I kept on as cook for the Ruckers and took in washing so I could earn some money and put it aside. And the 1863 Emancipation Proclamation granted colored folks the right to have fair wages for their labor. Well, when Dr. Rucker got help in getting out of Virginia jail, he joined us in Ohio. That war kept on going until General Lee surrendered April 9th, 1865. I was serving breakfast one day to the Ruckers when I overheard their conversation, and I learned the awful, awful news. President Lincoln and Mrs. Lincoln were out having a fine evening at the Ford Theater. He had wanted to see that famous British actress Laura Keene in the wildly popular comedy Our American Cousin. They were seated in the balcony, enjoying themselves, when that scoundrel John Wilkes Booth snuck up there and shot him point blank. That poor man died the next day. Everybody sitting at the table was stunned into silence. Nobody said anything. We just kind of looked at each other. And finally, I spoke up. I said, well, now the best friend of colored folks is dead. We colored people ought to raise a monument to his memory. So I went to my room and went to where I've been putting my money aside, and I counted it out, and I had $5. I took it down to Dr. Rucker and put it in his hand. I said, Dr. Rucker, you take this $5 and give it to somebody honest, and make sure it gets to where it needs to go, and someone who will help get the colored people together to raise the money for a statue to Mr. Lincoln. And he did. A notice was put in the St. Louis newspaper in 1865, and the word went out. The Western Sanitary Commission was chosen to collect the monies and get it to where it needed to go. Now, I said that it was $5, and that may not seem like a lot to you today, but back then that was a lot of money, and that was all the money I had saved in the world. Well, money started coming in from colored people all over the place. The soldiers and freed people. Everybody was collecting money. Do you know that altogether we raised over $21,000? I was proud of my people. Mr. Thomas Ball was selected to design the statue. He came up with a design where Lincoln was holding the Emancipation Proclamation in his right hand and had his left hand over the head of the emancipated slave. Now, some people had a problem with that kneeling figure, and even dear Mr. Frederick Douglass has something to say about it. He was there, and in his speech on the occasion of the 11th anniversary of Mr. Lincoln's death, said it would have been more manly if that figure had been standing and fully clothed. Now, there was a design where he was standing, but he was holding a rifle, and they didn't go with that one. No, I like to think that Mr. Lincoln's hand was bidding that man rise. You're no longer a slave. No need to bow and scrape. I like to think that man's knee is bent because he's getting up and he's looking up to a future of freedom. Some people thought Mr. Lincoln didn't care anything about the slaves. He just wanted to save the Union. But I say he was a friend to the end. Now, let me tell you this. If you come to Washington, D.C., I want you to go to Lincoln Park. That's in Northeast D.C., East Capitol Street, between 11th and 13th Street, and there you will see this statue. It's across from a statue of Mary McLeod Bethune. And if you go to the statue and look at the base of it, or the plaque, let me tell you what it says. It says, Freedmen's Memorial in grateful memory of Abraham Lincoln. This monument was erected by the Western Sanitary Commission of St. Louis, Missouri, with funds contributed solely by emancipated citizens of the United States declared free by its proclamation January 1st, A.D., 1863. The first contribution of $5 was made by Charlotte Scott, a freed woman of Virginia, being her first earnings in freedom, and consecrated by her suggestion and request on the day she heard of President Lincoln's death to build a monument to his memory. Yes, he was a friend to the Negro. I went back to Lynchburg afterwards to be with my man Willis so we could be a family again. They wrote about my passing in the Marietta, Ohio newspaper, but not the Lynchburg paper. Some people like to cling to old ways if it suits them. I also want to say that this was the very first monument to Mr. Lincoln ever. Even before the Lincoln Memorial on the tidal basin. Yes, if you have a friend, be a friend. Never forget who your friends are. That is what I want to leave with you now. Thank you. And last, I'd like to tell the story of Henry Brown. My name is Henry. My tale is true. After you hear it, I'd ask of you, what would you do for freedom? My wife and 3 children sold away. What be my fate if I must stay? If this is what good masters do, oh Lord, what chance have I? I had to leave this devil place. I knew I had to go. An angel whispered in my ear, you will soon be free. But how, I wondered to myself. And then it came to me, to ship myself inside a box by land and rail and sea. 2 friends, 1 black, 1 white, agreed to help for a hefty fee. For half of every cent I saved, liberty's price I willingly paid. Oh, listener, what would you do? To have a day I could not work, I burned my hand with acid, giving me time to meet my friends who sealed me in a box awaited, with only water for me to sip and a biscuit. 3 feet by 2 feet by 2.5 feet, the box. 5 feet 8 inches, 200 pounds, the man. Such a small box for such a large man. 3 small holes for air. 1 side labeled this side up, the other handled with care. Both ignored. Wagon by train, by boat, by wagon, train by ferry, by train. 27 hours in this condition. 27 hours in awkward positions. The box arrived in Freedom Land. A knock meant all is well. Arise. Out I came singing praise, seeing with the free man's eyes. What would you do for freedom, O listener? The ancestors ask of you. Would you have freedom by any means? O listener, what would you do? Thank you.